The Imperial fleet attacked Earth, humanity erased them in minutes. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet night. This was deeper. The kind of silence that presses against your ears like something physical. Every alarm on the monitoring array had triggered at the same moment, and the software, overwhelmed by the scale of what it was detecting, had simply stopped making noise. The screens were still flickering. The data was still pouring in. But the building itself had gone completely still, the way a person goes still when they see something that their brain has not yet found words for. My name is Yael Okonkwo, and I was the senior analyst on duty at the Unified Deep Space Monitoring Array on the morning the Empire arrived. I had been eating a sandwich. I put the sandwich down, walked to the main display, and looked at the numbers coming in from our outer sensor network. My first thought was that someone had made an error. Not a small error. A catastrophic one. The kind where someone had misplaced a decimal point and accidentally turned one ship into 1600. I ran the verification sequence myself. It took 11 seconds. There was no error. 1,642 vessels had dropped out of faster-than-light travel simultaneously, spreading across the inner solar system in a pattern so precise and so practiced that I knew, even before our tactical software confirmed it, that these were not explorers. Explorers spread out cautiously. Explorers send a single ship first. Whatever this was, it had done this before. It had done this many times before, to many worlds, and the formation it had chosen told me one very specific thing. It was not planning to leave without a response. I pressed the direct line to Director Alan Grove, my supervisor, who was 3 floors below me in a meeting about budget allocations for the following fiscal year. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Alan, you need to come upstairs right now." He started to ask why. I said, 1,600 ships. Inner system. Kill formation. There was a pause. Then I heard his chair scrape the floor, and the line went dead. I turned back to the screens and did what I had been trained to do. I started logging. The vessels were massive in a way that requires some explanation. A naval destroyer on Earth is roughly 150 meters long. The smallest ship in the formation I was looking at was approximately 4 kilometers from bow to stern. The largest, sitting at the center of the formation like a fist, was closer to 90 kilometers. It was not a ship in any normal sense of that word. It was a structure. It was a city. It was a monument to the idea that size itself was a weapon, that an enemy who saw you coming and understood the sheer scale of what you had built would lose the will to resist before a single shot was fired. I made a note in my log, formation flagship estimated 90 kilometers. Impressive engineering. Noted. I am not normally a sarcastic person. That morning was an exception. Alan arrived at my station 7 minutes after I called him. By then, 12 other analysts had assembled around the display, and no one was saying anything. The room had that particular quality of group silence where every person present knows that speaking first means being responsible for what comes next. Alan looked at the screens for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Have they transmitted anything?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "They've been holding position for 6 minutes. I think they're waiting for us to react." "They want to watch us panic," Alan said quietly. "Probably," I agreed. We did not panic. This was not because we were especially brave people. It was because the unified array had been built precisely for this moment. Not for this moment the way a fire extinguisher is built for a fire, where you hope to never use it. For this moment the way a surgeon's hands are built for surgery. Every person in that room had been trained, for years, on exactly this scenario. The specific parameters were new. The emotional reality of it was overwhelming. But the procedures were familiar, and procedures, when you have practiced them enough, are a kind of comfort. At the 8-minute mark, the transmission arrived. Our alien language processing system, a project that had been running for 112 years using intercepted galactic medium communications, translated it in under 4 seconds. The message was short. It identified the sender as the 3rd Imperial Expansion Fleet of the Galactic Sovereignty, under the command of Commodore Velron, operating under direct authority of the Imperial throne. It described Earth as a Class 4 unincorporated world. It informed us that unincorporated worlds were subject to sovereignty integration protocols. It gave us 1 hour to transmit a formal acknowledgement of Imperial authority. It did not ask. It did not negotiate. It informed. Alan read the translation twice. He set it down on the console. He looked at the formation on the screen. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely calm, "They've never been told no before." And I realized, looking at that formation, at the mathematical certainty of its positioning, at the complete absence of any defensive arrangement because they had never needed to defend themselves against anything they had ever approached, he was right. The Empire had expanded for centuries. It had consumed hundreds of worlds. And not one of those worlds had said no, not one of them had made the Empire wonder, even for a moment, whether this particular trip was a mistake. Earth had 3 minutes to respond before the Empire decided that silence meant something. We did not respond. I watched the clock on my screen tick past the 3-minute mark. I watched the tactical display as the formation adjusted slightly, the outer ring of vessels moving a fraction, recalibrating. I imagined Commodore Velron on his flagship, sitting in his command chair, looking at his own screens and seeing a small blue planet that was not answering his transmission. I imagined the specific quality of his confusion. He had done this dozens of times. The worlds always answered. The worlds always reacted with exactly the kind of fear and scrambling desperation that confirmed his own power. The silence would not read as strength to him. It would read as ignorance. And that was exactly what it was supposed to read as. At the 4-minute mark, 3 concentrated energy strikes left the Imperial formation and hit Earth's surface in 3 separate locations. The thermal bloom on my screen expanded to cover large portions of 3 different continental regions. Our seismic sensors registered the impacts. Our atmospheric monitors began logging the particulate spread. 3 cities were gone. The room around me remained silent. Not the silence of shock, though the shock was real. The silence of people who had been told, in every training session, in every scenario, in every briefing held in rooms like this over decades of preparation, that this moment would come. That the Empire would demonstrate. That the demonstration was not the end of anything. It was simply the Empire's way of introducing itself. Alan picked up the red terminal. He pressed a single key. The line connected to the Global Defense Council in under 1 second. Through the speaker, I heard the council chair's voice, steady and unhurried, as if she had been waiting by the phone. Alan said, "Authorization requested." She said, "Sentinel, you are authorized. All stations, all platforms, all assets. Full engagement authority. No limitations." Alan set the terminal down. He looked at me. He said, "Log the time." I looked at the clock. Then I typed the entry that would later become the most quoted sentence in the history of humanity's contact with the wider galaxy: Time of Defense Council authorization, full engagement authority granted. Sentinel activated. The Earth does not acknowledge the Empire's terms. The Earth has different terms. The screens around us began to change. What happened next was not a battle in any traditional sense of the word. It was not 2 armies meeting in a field. It was not a back-and-forth exchange of fire between forces of comparable strength. What happened next was the result of 200 years of patience, 200 years of silent construction, and 200 years of one species refusing to be found until it was ready. I pressed my back against the console and watched the displays. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, they had no idea what they had walked into. None at all. What we buried in the dark. I need to explain something about fear. Not the fear you feel when you drop something fragile, or when you almost step off a curb without looking. I mean the deep kind. The kind that gets into a civilization's bones and stays there for generations. The kind that does not go away when you lock the doors or build higher walls, because the thing you are afraid of is not outside the door. It is broadcasting its existence across the entire galaxy, and every night, if you know where to point your instruments, you can hear it. Earth picked up its first Imperial signal 193 years before the morning I am describing. It was not a deliberate message to us. It was a fragment. A piece of an administrative communication between 2 Imperial systems, bouncing off a gas cloud at the edge of the outer arm and drifting, weakened but still legible, across 30 light-years of empty space until it reached our radio telescopes and sat in a data archive for 11 months before a graduate student named Philip Osei noticed something strange in the compression patterns and pulled it open. Philip Osei was 26 years old. He sat in a cold university computer lab in Accra for 4 days straight, barely sleeping, running translation algorithms against a signal that he was increasingly, horribly certain was not natural. When he finally isolated enough structure to reconstruct even a partial meaning, he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The fragment described a planetary integration. It used language that Philip would later describe, in his classified report to the United Nations Emergency Science Committee, as the administrative language of consumption. It was not the language of exploration or diplomacy or even conquest in the old human sense. It was the language of a machine processing inputs. The planet in the fragment had a name in the Imperial registry. Then it had a different name. Then it had a resource classification. Then it was referenced only as a supply source for 2 other Imperial systems. There was no mention of the people who had lived there. Philip submitted his report through his university supervisor, who forwarded it to a government contact, who escalated it through 3 separate agencies before it reached a room where people were authorized to understand what it meant. That process took 9 days. 9 days during which Philip Osei went home and sat in his apartment and did not speak to anyone, because he could not think of anything to say that was not completely terrifying. The emergency committee convened in a secure facility in Geneva. 22 scientists, 12 government representatives, and 4 military strategists sat in a room with no windows and read Philip's translation. Then they read it again. Then the most senior person in the room, a retired admiral named Grace Holloway, folded her copy of the report and said, "All right. We have some decisions to make." The first and most important decision was silence. Earth went quiet. Not completely. We still broadcast entertainment signals, weather satellite data, the normal electromagnetic noise of a civilization going about its life. But every deep space research transmission, every attempt to respond to the fragments we were now actively hunting across the galactic medium, every signal that might carry the mathematical fingerprint of an advanced and organized intelligence, stopped. Within 3 years, the international science community, operating under a treaty that most of the public did not know existed, had reduced Earth's detectable intelligent signal output by 94%. To anyone scanning from a distance, Earth looked like it was still developing. A primitive world with primitive technology, generating the kind of low-level electromagnetic noise that a species makes when it has electricity but has not yet figured out much beyond that. This was the first layer of the plan. There would be many layers. The second layer was construction. Grace Holloway did not believe that silence alone was enough. She had read the fragment carefully. She had read the follow-up fragments that were recovered over the following 2 years as the monitoring program expanded and improved. She had seen the pattern. The Empire did not select targets based on intelligence signals alone. It sent scouts. Slow, cold, passive scouts that drifted through systems over decades, taking gravitational readings, measuring resource density, logging anything that looked like an inhabited world in a particular developmental range, worlds advanced enough to have useful infrastructure, not advanced enough to defend it. Earth fell into that range. If a scout had passed through our system before Philip Osei found that first fragment, we were already on a list somewhere. Holloway stood in front of the emergency committee's 3rd session and said, "I am not interested in hiding and hoping. I am interested in building a trap. And then waiting." It took the committee 6 months to agree. It took another 2 years to develop the technical specifications. It took the combined industrial capacity of every major nation on Earth, operating under a level of secrecy that had never been achieved in human history, to begin building it. The project was called Sentinel. Not a single weapon. Not an army. A system. A living, learning, continuously updating system that combined planetary defense infrastructure with the most sophisticated artificial intelligence humanity had ever constructed, built on one specific mandate: know the enemy completely before the enemy knows you exist. Sentinel spent its first 30 years doing nothing but learning. It processed every intercepted Imperial transmission. It built models of Imperial fleet tactics based on the fragments describing engagements with other worlds. It analyzed the mathematical structure of Imperial ship formation preferences, reaction times, communication protocols between vessels, command hierarchy vulnerabilities. It studied how Imperial fleets had moved against 9 different species across 7 different stellar environments, and it catalogued every single decision those fleets had made, right down to the standard scatter pattern an Imperial formation would execute when it detected an unexpected threat. While Sentinel learned, humanity built. The construction program was the largest secret in human history. It involved an estimated 800,000 people across 4 decades, working in underground facilities, inside hollowed asteroids, in deep space installations that were kept cold and electromagnetically silent. Workers signed agreements and meant them. Families were kept deliberately uninformed. Whole sections of industry were quietly redirected. Material that should have been accounted for in public records simply was not. What they built was extraordinary. In the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, 3,012 platforms were installed inside existing asteroids, using the rock itself as structural support and as camouflage. Each platform was powered by a cold fusion cell that produced no detectable heat signature when in standby mode. Each platform carried an array of weapons systems, long-range sensors, and communication relays. From outside, the asteroids looked exactly like asteroids. They had been looking like asteroids for 140 years when the Imperial fleet arrived. Beyond the belt, in the scattered disk and the inner Oort cloud, a network of drone launch facilities had been operating on low power for decades, each one holding a payload of relativistic impactor drones. These were not missiles in any conventional sense. They were dense metallic projectiles the size of small cars, accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light using a rail system that produced no visible exhaust, no plasma signature, no electromagnetic output that any scanner pointed at the solar system from outside would register as artificial. They were, to every sensor the Empire possessed, indistinguishable from the natural debris that drifts through every stellar system. The genius of the design was not the power of any single weapon. It was the timing. Each relativistic impactor drone, once launched, would travel cold and passive along a precalculated trajectory. The trajectories had been computed by Sentinel in advance, adjusted continuously as Sentinel tracked the Empire's scout probes and modeled the most statistically likely fleet formation positions. By the time the Imperial fleet actually arrived, Sentinel had pre-launch solutions ready for 432 different formation configurations. The Imperial fleet chose configuration number 89. Sentinel had a launch solution for that one too. But the most impressive piece of the system was not any weapon. It was what Sentinel had done to the space around Earth's solar system in the region where faster-than-light travel was easiest. Imperial ships, like all FTL-capable vessels, required what engineers called a clean jump window. This was a region of space with sufficiently low gravitational complexity that a vessel could fold space around itself without being torn apart by conflicting mass shadows. In open deep space, clean windows were everywhere. Inside a solar system, they were rarer. Near a star, near large planets, they required careful calculation. Sentinel had installed 64 mass shadow generators across the solar system. Each one was the size of a shipping container. Each one could be remotely activated to produce an artificial gravitational signature indistinguishable from a naturally occurring dense object. Collectively, when activated in the right sequence, they could close every viable jump window inside the heliosphere simultaneously. Any ship that tried to jump out of the solar system with those generators active would enter a fold attempt in what it believed was clean space, only to encounter a mass shadow it had not detected. The result was not survivable. I knew all of this. I had known all of this for my entire career. I had spent 20 years working inside the Sentinel program, studying the data, running simulations, contributing my own small pieces to a picture so large that no single person could hold it all in their mind at once. When the Imperial fleet appeared on my screens that morning, I was not seeing a catastrophe unfolding. I was watching the conclusion of a project that had begun 161 years before I was born. When Alan Grove pressed that key and the council chair said, "You are authorized," the asteroid belt platforms powered up. I watched it on the sensor display. 3,012 cold signatures suddenly blooming into full active power, spreading across a band of space that the Imperial fleet's sensors would be scanning in real time. The bloom lasted exactly 4 seconds. That was all it took to warm the systems to operational temperature. 4 seconds was also exactly how long it took for the Imperial fleet's sensor AI to process what it was seeing and send the alert up the command chain to Commodore Velron. I thought about Velron in that moment. I thought about him sitting in that enormous flagship, having just watched 3 cities burn, waiting for the expected response, the desperate transmissions, the pleading, the scrambling confusion of a species confronting something it had no framework for. Instead, he got 4 seconds of sensor bloom from 3,000 locations in the asteroid belt. And then, in the outer reaches of the system, in the darkness beyond Neptune, 63 cold fusion drive signatures ignited at once as the Oort cloud facilities came fully online. Sentinel had been waiting for this morning for a very long time. The trap was set. Everything was in position. The next 4 minutes would determine whether 2 centuries of patience had been enough. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I am reading from the official Sentinel engagement log, submitted to the Global Defense Council as part of the full incident record. I have been asked to read it into the hearing transcript without commentary. I will do my best, though the Council will understand if I occasionally fail. Time plus 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Relativistic impactor drones, pre-launched from Oort Cloud Facility 7 through Facility 19 between 6 and 8 hours prior to Imperial fleet arrival, are now within terminal approach range of the formation. Drones are traveling at 0.42 times the speed of light on cold passive trajectories. They are producing no engine signature, no electromagnetic output, no heat signature detectable at formation range. Imperial fleet sensors are not tracking them. The drones were launched before the fleet arrived. Sentinel calculated 6 different plausible formation positions based on the final scout probe data and launched separate drone spreads aimed at all 6. The Empire chose formation position 3. Drone spread 3 is on final approach. Time plus 0 minutes, 14 seconds. Sentinel activates all 64 mass shadow generators simultaneously. Every viable FTL jump window in the heliosphere collapses. From this moment, no vessel inside the solar system can successfully execute an FTL jump. Sentinel logs this activation and notes that at current Imperial sensor processing speeds, the fleet's tactical AI will require between 40 and 60 seconds to model the gravitational change and identify what has happened. Sentinel will be finished with its first engagement phase well before that analysis is complete. Time plus 0 minutes, 43 seconds. The first wave of relativistic impactors strikes the Imperial formation. 47 vessels are destroyed in the initial impacts. The strikes come from multiple angles simultaneously, which is not how any weapon the Empire has ever encountered works. Imperial fleet doctrine assumes weapons have a source point. These do not appear to have one. They appear to have come from the emptiness of deep space in 6 different directions at the same time, from objects that were not detected by any sensor array until they were 0.1 seconds from impact. The Imperial tactical AI's threat assessment response is not fast enough. Commodore Velron orders emergency scatter formation. This is standard Imperial protocol for an unexpected threat: spread the fleet to reduce the density of the formation and make mass targeting less effective. Sentinel predicted this response with 91% confidence. It predicted it weeks ago. The pre-calculated firing solutions for every possible scatter trajectory have been loaded and waiting in the asteroid belt platform targeting system since the fleet was first detected. Time plus 1 minute, 0 seconds. The asteroid belt platforms open fire. 3,012 weapons platforms, spread across the entire inner solar system, engage the scatter formation simultaneously. The Imperial fleet is northwest longer in one place. It has spread itself across a vast volume of space. This is exactly where the asteroid belt platforms have the maximum geometric advantage, because they are not in one place either. They are everywhere. They are the asteroid belt. The fleet scattered into a field of weapons. The Imperial tactical AI is now categorizing the threat origin as omnidirectional. This is the correct assessment. It has never seen an omnidirectional threat before. Its response protocols do not include a recommended action for this category. Time plus 1 minute, 18 seconds. The Empire's faster ships, the Scout-class vessels and light frigates at the outer edge of the scatter, attempt to jump. They have identified the mass shadow generators by this point and targeted 11 of them for destruction. They succeed in destroying 9 of the 11 before the platforms eliminate those vessels. But Sentinel had anticipated this possibility and built in redundancy. The loss of 9 generators out of 64 does not open a viable jump window. The FTL escape route remains closed. The ships that attempt to jump anyway do not survive the attempt. Time plus 1 minute, 52 seconds. A second wave of relativistic drones strikes the formation. These were the backup spread, pre-launched from the inner Oort facilities, aimed at the formation position that Sentinel calculated the fleet would have scattered into by this point in the engagement. The calculation was correct to within 3%. At this point in the engagement, 614 Imperial vessels have been destroyed or are structurally compromised beyond operational capacity. The remaining 1,028 are continuing to execute scatter, engage platform targets where visible, and attempt to coordinate a response. The Imperial fleet is not broken yet. It is still functional. It is still dangerous. Its remaining firepower, if concentrated effectively, could cause significant additional damage to Earth's surface. Sentinel is aware of this. Sentinel has been aware of this the entire time. The Phase 1 platforms were not designed to destroy the fleet. They were designed to scatter it, to cause specific vessels to move to specific positions in the system, to create the geometry that the second stage of the engagement requires. Time plus 2 minutes, 31 seconds. The secondary platforms, located on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and on 14 large trans-Neptunian objects that have been quietly equipped over the past 60 years, come online. These are longer-range systems. They were waiting for the scatter formation to be fully committed before activating, because activating early would have allowed the fleet to adjust its scatter pattern. Now the fleet is committed. The vessels are where Sentinel calculated they would be. The secondary platforms have preloaded firing solutions for every ship in the current scatter formation. The engagement enters its final phase. Time plus 2 minutes, 55 seconds. The Imperial flagship transmits a ceasefire request. It is the first communication Earth has received from the Empire that is not a demand. It identifies itself as originating from Commodore Velron's personal command channel. It requests a pause in hostilities for the purpose of opening diplomatic contact. I could have acted on this. I want the Council to understand that clearly. I was monitoring the transmission in real time. I had direct override access to Sentinel's engagement sequence. I could have interrupted it. I chose not to. The 3 cities were still burning. I am not saying that is the correct justification. I am saying it is the honest one. I sat at my console and I watched that transmission come in, and I made a decision in approximately 2 seconds, and then I turned back to the engagement log and kept reading. The Council can determine what that decision says about my fitness for this role. I accept whatever conclusion you reach. Time plus 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The secondary platforms complete their engagement of the scatter formation. The Imperial fleet is now reduced to approximately 400 functional vessels, concentrated mostly in the outer system where the scatter pattern was thinnest and the secondary platform coverage was less dense. These remaining vessels are attempting to regroup. They are also, Sentinel notes, beginning to behave in a way that is outside normal Imperial fleet doctrine. They are not attacking. They are not defending in any organized way. They are attempting to go cold. They are reducing their power output, minimizing their electromagnetic signatures, attempting to look like debris. This is not an Imperial fleet tactic. Sentinel has no record of any Imperial fleet ever attempting to hide. They do not have protocols for it. What I am watching on the display, through the sensor data, is 400 ships full of beings who have realized that they cannot win and cannot run and cannot fight and are now doing the only thing left, which is trying to disappear. It will not work. Sentinel's passive gravity wave detection array, built into 53 anchor points across the heliosphere, does not use electromagnetic sensors. It detects the gravitational distortion produced by any object with mass moving through space. You cannot turn off your mass. You cannot hide from a sensor that feels the shape your weight makes in spacetime. Time plus 4 minutes, 2 seconds. Final engagement phase. Sentinel's passive gravity network has located all remaining Imperial vessels, and the asteroid belt platforms have adjusted targeting solutions accordingly. Sentinel flags 11 vessels as potential hospital ships based on their power signature ratios and withholds targeting on them. This was programmed in. Humanity did not want to destroy vessels that might be carrying wounded. Time plus 4 minutes, 17 seconds. The last actively operational Imperial combat vessel, a scout frigate that had gone completely cold and was drifting in a slow arc toward the outer system, is targeted and rendered non-functional by a single platform strike. Sentinel reports, engagement complete. Total Imperial vessels neutralized, 1,631. Total engagement duration from first impactor strike to last platform action, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I closed the log. The hearing room was completely quiet. I looked at the council chair. She was writing something on her notepad. Around the table, council members were looking at their own copies of the transcript, or looking at the table, or looking at somewhere in the middle distance that was not really anywhere in the room. I had been asked to read without commentary. I had managed it. More or less. The council chair set down her pen. She looked at me. She said, "Dr. Okonkwo, you mentioned that you chose not to interrupt the engagement when the ceasefire request came in at 2 minutes and 55 seconds. Yes, I said. Do you regret that decision? I thought about the 3 cities. I thought about the thermal blooms on the screen. I thought about what those blooms represented. I regret a great many things about that morning, I said. I have been careful not to identify which specific regrets are mine and which ones belong to the Empire. The council chair nodded slowly. She said, "This hearing will recess for 15 minutes. I poured myself a glass of water. My hands were entirely steady. What the survivors carried home. The escape pod was the size of a large car. It had been drifting for 9 days when our recovery vessel found it near the upper atmosphere of Jupiter, tumbling slowly end over end, its emergency beacon transmitting a signal on a frequency that Sentinel had never categorized as hostile. We almost missed it. One of the junior technicians on the recovery team, a young man named Callum, spotted the beacon code in a passive scan sweep and flagged it almost as an afterthought. Inside the pod was a single occupant. He was not what most people expected. The broader public had seen images of Imperial soldiers in the fragments and decoded transmissions over the years. The prevailing cultural image of an Imperial service member was something imposing, something designed by a species that had spent centuries winning. The reality, in the cramped recovery bay of our vessel, was a young man sitting on the floor of a pod with his knees pulled to his chest, wearing a gray uniform that was several sizes too large for his thin frame, blinking at the humans around him with large dark eyes that contained no hostility whatsoever. Just exhaustion. Just fear. And something else. Something that took me a moment to identify, when I walked into that recovery bay and first saw him through the observation glass. Relief. He was relieved to be found. His name, once our translation systems worked through the vocalization patterns, was SOV. Or rather, SOV was the closest phonetic approximation our systems could produce of a sound he made with the back of his throat. He accepted the name without complaint. He accepted most things without complaint. He sat in the small medical observation room on the Earth facility where we had transferred him, and he answered every question I asked, and when I asked him to explain something he was uncertain about, he tried again with different words, and the overall impression he gave was not of a prisoner or a conquered enemy but of someone who was deeply, genuinely glad to have someone to talk to. I had been assigned to his case because I was the analyst with the most comprehensive knowledge of Imperial culture and language derived from the interceptions. I was not a psychologist. I was not a diplomat. But I spoke his language better than anyone else on Earth, and in the early days, communication was the only thing that mattered. Our first real conversation happened on his 3rd day at the facility. Prior to that, we had covered logistics. Food, medical needs, physical comfort, basic orientation. On the 3rd day, he had rested enough to be present in the way that counts, and I sat across from him in the observation room with a cup of tea that he had already decided he enjoyed, and I asked him to tell me about himself. He was 23 years old. He had grown up on a colony world in the 3rd ring of Imperial space, a place called Velderit in the Imperial Registry, which had been incorporated into the sovereignty 60 years before he was born. His parents worked in an agricultural processing facility. His colony produced grain and was paid in Imperial credits, which could only be spent on Imperial goods, which were priced by Imperial administrators, which meant his parents earned exactly enough to stay housed and fed and not much more. Military service changed that calculation. For a low-tier colony citizen, enlistment in the Imperial Navy opened doors that were otherwise sealed. Better housing for your family. Education credits. Citizenship tier advancement, which determined what jobs you could apply for, which neighborhoods you could live in, which medical facilities you could use. SOV had enlisted at 17. He had been trained as a signals and communications officer. In 6 years of service, he had never been in a combat engagement. He had translated transmissions, maintained relay equipment, filed administrative reports. He had been on the Imperial flagship because he was the best junior signals officer in the fleet. That was the only reason. He had been assigned to the command vessel as a recognition of his performance evaluations, and he had been proud of the assignment in the way that a young person is proud of being recognized, before they fully understand what the recognition is for. He had been in a maintenance compartment at the rear of the flagship when the engagement began. The compartment was deep inside the ship's interior structure, shielded by enormous amounts of material. The impacts that destroyed the vessel's command sections and propulsion systems left his compartment intact and drifting. He had found an escape pod and launched it before the secondary atmosphere failure reached him. That was all. That was the entire story of how he survived while 1,600 ships did not. I asked him what he had expected to find at Earth. He thought about this. He picked up his tea and held it in both hands, the way people do when they want something warm to hold onto, and he said, "A primitive world." That is what the briefing said. The survey data was old, but the briefing said that it was a young civilization. Developing. They had some electromagnetic activity but no FTL signature, no organized deep space presence. Class 4. Easy integration. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked around the room. He looked at the walls, at the lighting system, at the environmental controls, at the water filtration unit on the side table, objects that were utterly ordinary to me and clearly extraordinary to him. This facility, he said slowly. I have been trying to understand it. The engineering. The materials. The systems I can observe, he paused. This is not a Class 4 civilization. No, I said. It is not. How long, he asked carefully, have you been at this level? And that was when I told him about the project. About Philip Osei and the fragment. About Grace Holloway and the emergency committee. About the 193 years of preparation, the construction, the silence, the long patient waiting for a morning that we all hoped would never come but built for anyway. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a very long time. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but the opposite, too full to speak. Finally he said, you built all of that because of us. Because of the Empire. Because of what we learned about the Empire, I said. Yes. We never knew, he said. It was not a question. That was the point, I said. He set down his tea. He looked at the table between us. He said, in a voice that was very quiet, on my home world. Velderet. When we fail an assignment, the administrative authority reduces the colony's resource allocation. It is standard policy. When a fleet fails its mission, the punishment typically falls on the colonies that provided the conscripts. He stopped. My colony provided 63 members of the Third Fleet. I understood what he was telling me. We are already broadcasting the engagement log to every system on the Imperial communication network, I said. Not as a threat. As information. We want the Empire's administrators to understand exactly what happened here before they make any decisions about consequences. He looked up at me. I said, we also want the 63 worlds that had conscripts in that fleet to understand what happened. We want them to see the same data. We want everyone to have the same information. He was very still. You are not afraid of the Empire, he said. We prepared for the Empire for almost 2 centuries, I said. That tends to reduce the fear somewhat. Something shifted in his face then. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked, to me, like the specific expression a person makes when they realize that a thing they believe to be permanent might not be. When the walls of something they were told was unbreakable develop a visible crack. He asked me, over the following weeks, many questions. He asked about our political structure, our economy, our history of internal conflicts, our methods for resolving disagreement between groups. He asked about our food, our cultural practices, our art. He was particularly interested in our history of failure, the mistakes we had made as a civilization, the catastrophes we had caused and survived and tried to learn from. He found this, he told me, genuinely remarkable. The Empire does not teach failure, he said one afternoon. Imperial history is the history of victories. There are no chapters about what did not work. No analysis of decisions that were wrong. If something failed, it is not in the record. What happens to the people who were responsible for the failures, I asked. They are not in the record either, he said. I thought about that. I thought about what it did to a civilization, over centuries, to remove every example of failure from its collective memory. To have, as the only available model for every decision, the assumption that the Empire was correct and that the people who questioned it were simply wrong. To have no language for the possibility that power itself could be mistaken. I thought about the Imperial fleet, spreading across the inner solar system in that perfect formation, and I understood for the first time that the formation was not just a tactical choice. It was a philosophical one. They arranged themselves that way because that was the only arrangement they knew. They had never needed another one. They had never encountered an enemy who had spent 2 centuries studying all of their arrangements and building the counters for every single one. Callum, the young technician who had spotted SOV's beacon, had taken to visiting during the afternoon session breaks. He was 22, not far from SOV's age, and they had developed a cautious and curious friendship built largely on showing each other things they found interesting. Callum had introduced SOV to chess. SOV had beaten Callum at chess 11 times before Callum asked why he was so good at it. SOV said, I used to calculate jump window navigation by hand during training. It is the same kind of pattern recognition. Callum said, you used to do that by hand. We have computers for that. SOV said, Imperial doctrine does not trust automated navigation calculations. Officers are required to verify them manually. Callum stared at him. That sounds like an enormous waste of time. SOV tilted his head slightly. Yes, he said. Now that you say that. Yes, I believe it is. I watched these exchanges and tried to understand what they meant. What it meant for two young men from civilizations that had just been at war to sit across from each other over a chessboard and argue about efficiency. What it said about both of them. What it said about what might still be possible. On SOV's 42nd day at the facility, I asked him directly what he wanted to do. Whether he wanted to be returned to Imperial space, assuming a mechanism for that could be arranged. Whether he wanted something else. He thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "The Empire will not want me back. I survived when the fleet did not. That is not a distinction they will see as favorable." "Then what do you want?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "I want to be useful," he said. "I am very good at communications. I understand the Imperial system better than most people on this planet. You are going to need someone who can explain the Empire from the inside, in a way that lets you understand it well enough to talk to it without starting another war." He paused. "I would like to do that." I thought about the 37 transmission requests sitting in our incoming queue from colonial worlds across Imperial space who had watched our engagement log broadcast and wanted to make contact. I thought about the diplomatic situation we were standing in the middle of, with no map and no experience and no one who had ever done anything like this before. I said, "I think we can work with that." He almost smiled. It was small. Careful. Like he was not entirely sure he was allowed to do it yet. But it was there. The message we sent back. 6 months, 11 days, and approximately 4 hours after the morning everything changed, I was back at my station at the Unified Array, and every screen in the building was full of incoming transmissions. Not threat signatures. Not fleet movements. Not the cold hard mathematics of objects moving toward Earth with hostile intent. Just signals. Voices, essentially, of every wavelength and modulation, pouring in from 37 different points across the galaxy, all pointed at the same small blue planet, all saying variations of the same thing in approximately 30 different languages. "We hear you. We saw what happened. We have been waiting for someone to do that for a very long time." I had not slept in 31 hours. Callum had brought me coffee 3 times and a sandwich once, and I had thanked him for the coffee and forgotten about the sandwich entirely. Director Alan Grove had gone home for a proper rest at my insistence and was now back, standing next to my station with his own coffee, looking at the transmission list with an expression that seemed to balance somewhere between professional astonishment and genuine personal wonder. 37, he said, for the 3rd time since he had come back. 38 as of 4 minutes ago, I said. Someone new from the outer arm. He shook his head slowly. Not negatively. Just the physical expression of a brain encountering something it had not fully modeled. What had happened was this. In the hours following the engagement, Sentinel had broadcast a complete record of the event across every Imperial communication frequency we had mapped over the previous century. Not an edited version. Not a message of triumph or a declaration of anything. The raw data. Sensor logs, targeting records, timeline documentation, the ceasefire request and our non-response, the 11 vessels we had withheld targeting from. Everything. Presented without commentary, in a format that any civilization with Imperial standard communication technology could decode. The stated purpose, in the cover transmission, was transparency. We were telling the Empire what had happened in terms the Empire could verify against its own records. We were making it impossible for the Imperial administration to present a different version of events to its own people. The actual effect, which we had anticipated but had not fully prepared for, was that we had broadcast our engagement record to every system in Imperial space. And Imperial space contained not just Imperial administration worlds but over 300 incorporated colonial systems, many of which had been receiving these transmissions for decades, sharing them through their own internal networks, and quietly, carefully, building their own picture of a galaxy that their administrators did not want them to see clearly. Those colonies saw the broadcast. They saw what we had built. They saw that we had built it specifically in response to what the Empire was, and what the Empire did, and what the Empire planned to do to every unincorporated world it could reach. They saw that we had done it quietly, without asking for help, without anyone knowing, and they drew conclusions from that which were not all the same but which pointed in the same general direction. The direction pointed toward Earth. The transmissions coming in were from 14 distinct species across 37 colonial systems. Some were formal. Some were raw and urgent and clearly composed quickly by people who were not sure how long they had before someone official noticed what they were doing. Some were just a single phrase, repeated, with coordinates attached. One of them said, in a translation that I had to run 4 times before I trusted it, "We knew someone was out there listening. We have been hoping for 40 years. Please write back." I wrote back to every single one. I was still working through the queue when Alan touched my arm and said, "Yael, there is something on the outer sensor net that you need to see." I looked. The second Imperial fleet had arrived. It was larger than the first. Our initial count put it at 3,200 vessels. It was holding position at the very edge of the heliosphere, at a distance of approximately 150 astronomical units, which put it well outside the Sentinel engagement envelope. It was not moving toward Earth. It was simply there, in a holding pattern, its engines active but not accelerating in any direction. It was waiting. Alan said, very carefully, "That is 3,000 ships at 150 O. They stopped at the edge of our sensor range." "They know what our sensor range is," I said. "They stopped where they could see us without being inside the zone where they would have to commit." "They are afraid to come closer," Alan said. "They are assessing," I said. "There is a difference. Afraid people run away. People who are assessing stop and think." I looked at the formation for a moment. "They have read the engagement log by now. They know what Sentinel did to the First Fleet. They know we can see everything they are doing, and they know we knew everything the First Fleet was going to do before it happened. They are trying to figure out if the same logic applies to them." "Does it?" Alan asked. "Yes," I said simply. "Sentinel has been running engagement models on a force of this size and configuration for the last decade. They stopped exactly where the models predicted a rational Imperial commander would stop if they were given the full engagement data first." I paused. "Commodore Velron did not have that data. Whoever is commanding this fleet did." Alan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do they want?" "They want to know if there is a version of this conversation that does not end the way the last one did," I said. "And they want us to offer it, because offering it themselves would be an admission that they need it. Imperial doctrine does not permit that kind of admission. So they are waiting for us to make the first move," Alan said. "They are waiting for us to decide whether we want a different kind of relationship than the one they came here offering the first time," I said. "Which is actually a reasonable thing to wait for, given the circumstances." Alan looked at me. "Do we?" I thought about the 38 incoming transmissions from colonial worlds. I thought about SOV and his chess games with Callum and his patient, careful attempts to explain an empire that he had served without fully understanding. I thought about Philip Osei, who had been 26 years old in a cold computer lab in Accra when he found a fragment in the dark and changed the course of human history because he noticed something strange and could not leave it alone. I thought about what 200 years of silence and patience and preparation had been for. "Yes," I said. "We want a different relationship. We just need them to understand what that actually means." I opened a communication channel. Not a broadcast. A direct channel, addressed to the command vessel of the Second Fleet. I composed the message carefully, with SOV's help, because the nuances of Imperial diplomatic language were complex and there were words that meant one thing in administrative context and a different thing in military context, and getting them confused would send exactly the wrong signal. The message was short. It said, "You have read the record. You know what we can do. We are not interested in using it. We are interested in a conversation, not with the Imperial administration, but with the 14 colonial systems whose representatives are currently transmitting to us through unofficial channels. We would like your fleet to serve as witness to those conversations. Not as enforcer. As witness. If you find that acceptable, reduce engine output to 10% and hold your current position. We will interpret that as agreement." We waited. For minutes and 22 seconds after I sent the message, a time that I noticed and did not comment on out loud, the sensor array registered a collective reduction in the Second Fleet's engine output to exactly 10%. They were staying. They were watching. Callum came to my station about an hour later and told me that SOV had asked to observe the communications with the colonial worlds, and asked whether that was acceptable. I said yes without hesitation. SOV arrived in the communications room 20 minutes after that, in civilian clothes we had provided him, and sat at a side console and put on a headset and began listening to the transmissions with an expression on his face that I can only describe as someone hearing, for the first time, the sound of something they had believed was impossible. He stayed for 11 hours without taking a break. When I finally told him he needed to sleep, he looked at me and said, "There are people on 6 of these worlds who are using a specific phrase that does not translate well into standard Imperial. It is a phrase from a colonial dialect. It means approximately, I want to be a person who decides things for myself." "Yes," I said. "I know. They have been saying it quietly to each other for decades," he said. "In signals they did not believe anyone outside their systems would ever receive." "They were wrong about that," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to be the one who talks to Veldaret when that contact comes. If that is allowed." I looked at him. "SOV," I said, "you are going to be the most valuable person in this building for the next several years. You can talk to whoever you want." His almost smile came back. More certain this time. Less careful. I left him at the console and walked to the window at the end of the communications room that looked out over the array field, the great dishes pointing up at a sky full of signals. It was early morning. The light was coming up pale and thin over the eastern hills. Somewhere above that light, 3,000 Imperial ships were holding position and watching. I thought about Grace Holloway, who had stood in front of the emergency committee over a century and a half ago and said she was not interested in hiding and hoping. I thought about all the people who had worked for decades in underground facilities and asteroid installations and deep space silence, building something that most of them would never see used. I thought about what they had imagined, if they let themselves imagine, about what the morning it all mattered would look like. I do not know what they imagined. I know what I found. I found 38 transmissions from worlds that had been waiting for someone to notice them. I found a young man who had survived the worst morning of his life and decided to spend whatever came after it trying to translate the gap between two civilizations. I found a massive Imperial fleet sitting quietly at the edge of our system, reduced to 10% engine power, watching. I found that the hardest part of 200 years of preparation had not been the building, or the silence, or the waiting. The hardest part was figuring out what to do when it worked. I went back to my station. I started writing back. There was a lot of correspondence to get through. Alan appeared at my elbow at some point in the mid-morning with a fresh cup of coffee and the sandwich I had forgotten from the night before, still wrapped, slightly worse for time but technically still edible, and he set them both down next to my keyboard without saying anything. I ate the sandwich. It was not good. It was, considering everything, one of the best meals I had ever had. The transmissions kept coming in. The colonial worlds kept calling. The Second Fleet held its position and watched. SOV translated. Callum made more coffee and asked questions and played chess badly and made everyone around him feel, without trying to, that this extraordinary situation was manageable because ordinary people were in it together. The screens were full. We had a great deal of work to do. For the first time in a long time, I was glad of it. Somewhere above us, the galaxy was learning that Earth answered its transmissions. Not with fleets. Not with threats. Not with the language of dominance that had moved across the stars for centuries and consumed everything it touched. With words. With patience. With the specific human stubbornness that says, "We are still here. We have been here a long time. We know what you are capable of and we chose to build something different. We are going to keep choosing that, if you will let us. And if you will not let us, well. You know what we built in the dark. But we would really rather talk."